Reverse by Black K. Cat. Chapter 50. Autonomy. The return to consciousness comes with a heavy pulse of pain tearing through her nerves. With short, hard shocks she can't quite manage to ride out. Kushina squeezes her eyes closed and groans, pressing one hand to her chest. Electricity, she thinks, forcing herself to sit up and can't tell if the memories are blurry from the shock or the control seal. A bit of both, probably. She can remember bits and pieces and blurred impressions from beforehand, but then she thinks of bright light and... nothing. The past looks like a dozen others in Fire Country, so there's no help of orienting herself there. The battle going on doesn't help much either, though Kushina recognizes some of the guys from earlier. Orochimaru isn't immediately visible, though she's not sure whether that's a good thing or a bad one. Mixed blessing, Kushina tells herself, and pushes to her feet. One step unsteady and wavering, and she grits her teeth, forcing her legs to hold her up when all they want to do is buckle. Another tremor runs through her muscles, spasming and almost driving her to her knees, but she staggers and then forces herself to straighten. Naruto, she thinks, and pushes forward. Hey! A gruff voice barks, and she stops looking around. Someone close, but... Hey! The voice repeats, miffed, and there's a sharp bark. Kushina turns, sweeping a look over the surrounding area. A small, brown pug is watching her warily. 7 other dogs of various sizes group behind him. In the midst of them is Sakuma, unconscious, which, given what just happened, probably means they're allies rather than enemies. Something I can help you with? Kushina asks a little warily, studying the pack. Kanaha Hitayate, she realizes belatedly, and gapes. Is cute, but unless something has changed, it's definitely not Inuzuka standard. Inuzuka and Inken can't talk either, which means that these are summons. The pug studies her for a moment, then turns to the massive black bulldog sitting with his paws braced on Sakamo's back. There's a moment of wordless communication, and then the pug asks, You going to attack boss again? Another muscle tremor shakes through her, and Kushina grits her teeth to rat it out, sinking to one knee. A breath to steady herself, and she tries to think back, tries to remember what just happened. She can remember lightning and fire, a kind of flak jacket, and a furious snarl, but everything else is scattered. The seal broke, she tells the pug instead of asking who he means. The only people I'm going to attack are the assholes who put it on me. That gets her a sound like a bark of laughter, gruffly amused. Boss'll be happy to hear that once he gets done with things. Things leaves a lot of options given the battle taking place further into the canyon. There is no one close that Kushina recognizes, but she closes her eyes and digs her fingers into the seal that's still splayed across her throat. A grimace, a moment of concentration, and she summons what bits of chakra leak through the weave of it. It's swallowing her power right now, draining her, even though the mental control array is broken and she isn't a Jinchuriki anymore. She doesn't have enough to overload it, but... a touch of finesse, a sharp tug, a surge of effort, and Kushina tears the whole thing out by its roots. The flood of her chakra returning is a dizzying rush, but with it comes something else entirely. The Kyuubi! She cries, staggering to her feet. He's awake and raging, thrashing against loosened chains, and Kushina knows just how strong he can be when he's angry. Half of his chakra died with another, but Naruto... Naruto is his jailer now. Naruto is a child, and Kushina has to help him! There's a quick flurry of voices behind her, and then the pug is bounding past her ankles. This way, he orders. Boss went there too. I'll bring it to him. Kushina doesn't waste time telling the summons that right now she could find her way to the source of that chakra blindfolded and half dead of blood loss. She knows the Kyuubi's power better than anyone but Mito, after all, knows his rage and his cunning. Forcing herself forward, she stumbles into a run, ignoring the lingering ache. Kumonin have always been fond of Riton jutsus, after all, and she's fought them before. This isn't any different. Given enough time, the pain will fade. It always does. It's so stupid, though, she thinks, dodging an auburn-haired woman, directing a wave of lava at a woman with blue hair. She's so stupid. There was supposed to be time for her counter shield to work, travel time and preparation time, but she didn't expect them to be dropped right into a battle like this. How close to where they were being held does this have to be? The seal she created only needed an hour to start working, if even that. How the heck was she supposed to know that the fight was apparently happening right outside their door? Ahead of her, the bug disappears over the lip of an incline and Kushina bounds after him, skidding across loose rocks as she slides towards the river at the bottom. The QB's chakra is on their left, around an outcropping of stone, and Kushina hits the riverbank at a run, outpacing the bug in an instant. She leaps the rocks in one hard bound, touching down lightly on the other side, and... her son. He looks like Minato, she thinks in that one frozen moment. Blonde hair, a tendency to tan, the way his hair falls, and an uncontrollable mess around his face. Kushina takes a step towards him, hardly able to breathe, and reaches out.
You're not going to be able to save them.
A quiet voice behind her says. Kushina spins, grabbing a kunai automatically, but it practically slips from nerveless fingers when she realizes who's standing behind her.
You!
She snarls, sharp and vicious. It's not the same mask, and he has shorter hair, but he's familiar enough for her to know. The masked man who attacked them that night is right in front of her, wearing a familiar black cloak with red clouds and carrying an uchi agumbai as if it weighs nothing. Behind her, the QB's chakra flares and thrashes, caught within the fragile confines of her son's body, and Kushina's breath catches in her throat with the force of the unwelcome memory. Kisame gives a low chuckle from the man's left. There's a massive sword slung across his back, and he's holding a terrifyingly familiar figure by the throat. Kakashi casts her a desperate glance, trying to wriggle out of Kasame's hold, even when the former Kirin is hanging onto both of his wrists and his throat. He looks older, almost her age now, but he's still Kakashi.
Let him go!
She snarls, slamming her chakra into golden links, and her chains shimmer into being around her. They surge forward in a devastating rush, the air shimmering with power, and just for a moment, Kushina allows herself to think it will work, to hope. The masked man goes straight through them, the way he did before, and Kisame leaps out of the way. He lands lightly, then drags Kakashi forward, grabs his chin on one big hand, and jerks his head around to break his neck with one vicious twist. Kushina lunges a cry of desperate fury, caught in her throat, ducks under the arc of the masked man's gunbai. With a puff of smoke, Kakashi vanishes. A clone! A clone! Kushina thinks, and the overraged hurt that courses through her like a wildfire is enough to bleed viciousness into her snarl. Into the kunai she drives towards Kisame's throat. He jerks back, sword practically leaping into his hand as he blocks her next strike, but instead of pushing forward, he steps away, lets the masked man slide in to take his place.
Kisame,
the masked man says, and Kushina can see his Sharingan eye begin to spin, slow and hypnotic.
Deal with the traitor!
Kisame laughs low and rumbling and offers a cheeky salute. Consider the snake dead and gone, he promises, leaping up the bank and disappearing over the edge. Kushina feels a pang halfway between guilt and regret because Orochimaru is the reason she had enough warning to craft a counter-seal. She's not about to go after Kasame, though she can't. Naruto is here, and the masked man is a greater threat than the swordsman.
Tearing my family apart once wasn't enough for you!
She hisses, and her grip on the kunai is white-knuckled.
What the heck do you want with us, you goddamn bastard?
The masked man snorts, quiet but mocking.
You're collateral,
he says simply, winding the gunbai's chain around his fist.
What I want is the Kyuubi no Kitsune. Step aside and leave it to me, and I won't care what you do. That's a lie! You didn't have to turn the Kyuubi on Konoha! You didn't have to threaten Naruto and try to kill Minato! I was the one you wanted, so you should have focused on me!
A pause, as if he's weighing the accusation carefully.
Konoha is a den of lies and petty sins,
he says, and this time there's an edge of anger in his deep voice.
The Kyuubi would have turned on the village eventually. I simply gave it more reason to do so.
Kushina breathes out, ragged and furious. She's Zanbu. She knows better than anyone what Kana hides in its shadows. It's not perfect, and it never has been, but it's been her village since the day Uzushio fell. All of her happiest memories are there, all the things she loves best of all, and she's not dead, not a ghost, not some shade. She's alive! And if the masked man was the one to pick her to bring back, he just made the biggest mistake of his pathetic life. I'm going to kill you! She growls, and her chakra is rising, bleeding golden into the air around her and making her hair swirl like it's caught in a breeze. You're the reason Minato died! I'm going to kill you for that, and for the way you threatened Naruto, and for the way you turned my burden on my village. She lunges, teeth bared, kunai arcing towards his throat. Leaping back, he swings the battle fan around to block, and her blade strikes with a clang of metal on petrified wood. With a snarl of frustration, Kushina drops, kicking out at his legs, but he flips over her, lashing out the moment his sandals touch the ground. Kushina gets her feet under herself, launches up and over his head, even as she brings her hands together, and the river surges. Plumes of water rise, shifting and morphing into a whole host of dragons, and they crash towards the masked man like a wave breaking. Kushina's will keeps the water contained, keeps it thundering down on the masked man again and again while Naruto stays safe and dry, but she already knows it's not enough. Simultaneous full-force jutsus are practically impossible, the chakra required too great for even most Jonin to manage, but Kushina is an Uzumaki. Impossible is just another challenge to be overcome. And she defeated this one a long time ago. Half of her attention still on the Suiton Jutsu, she brings her hands together again, carefully shaping the seals. Wind is less familiar than water, but this is a simple technique, and one she's used frequently. She lets it build, thinks of her timing, and moves! In an instant, the water arcs back toward the river, and Kushina spins a hard leap forward right to where the masked man is just emerging from thin air, and she slams a punch into his side. The knife-edged wind wrapped around her face cuts deep in the half-second before he leaps back, but Kushina follows, fists swinging. Left again, a hard punch from the right around Av's kick, and none of them connect a second time, but she's pushing the bastard back towards the slope, away from her son, and that's all she cares about. With a whirl, the man turns and slides out of her path, bringing his gunbai up like a shield, and then throwing it out like a weapon the moment her blow connects. Kushina dodges around, chakra keeping her feet steady as she slides across the earth, and with a jump and a hard twist, she throws herself over his head, landing behind him and lunging. He disappears completely, and in the same moment of light, of shuriken are launched out of the warping spiral of air that whisks him away. With a curse, Kushina rapidly retreats, deflecting one blade with her kunai and letting the rest bury themselves in the ground around her. She catches the one she blocked. As it rebounds, slams her chakra into it, and doesn't bother to watch as the seal carves itself into the metal. Sloppy, her teacher in Uzushiya, would have said always better to draw a seal than simply picture it and create it, because no human mind is flawless, but Kushina doesn't have time for precision. She can remember Minato's fight with the masked man, what she managed to see of it. He's too fast, too clever, entirely unpredictable. It's a good thing Kushina is more cunning than her husband ever managed to be. The moment the air starts to warp, she turns the shuriken, leaving her fingers in a blur of black metal. She follows it, summoning a wind, and hopes that between herself and the jutsu, the shuriken will go unnoticed. The masked man ducks out of the way, but doesn't try to catch it, and Kushina laughs viciously, whirling it and stepping upward towards his chin. He hops back by swinging around with enough force to break bones, but Kushina vaults over it, kicks out of his kneecap, and then ducks the loops of chain that follow. One hand on it, coated with chakra to negate the force as it moves, and Kushina drags the chain down, gets a foot on its length, then pins it to the ground, driving her kunai through the links. The masked man snarls, pulling, but before he can rip it free, Kushina throws herself at him, uncaring that she's barehanded now. A hard punch in the ribs, right where she grazed him earlier, and while he's trying to retreat, she snarls and spins, using the force of it to drive a roundhouse kick into his gut. It's with a vicious feeling of success that Kushina watches him tumble across the ground. She gets her feet under herself, pushes up straight, and she's breathing hard, but not tired at all. The muscle spasms are gone, buried under the thunder of her heartbeat, and this feels like redemption for the night Naruto was born. She couldn't help then, not against the masked man, and she couldn't seal the Kyuubi by herself, sparing Minato. Now, though, she's not half dead from having the Biju extracted, not weakened by childbirth. She's Uzumaki Kushina, Jonin of Kana, a mother and fighter, and no one is ever going to touch her family again! Leaning down, she pulls two more shuriken from the dirt, smooths her thumb over them like all she's doing is wiping the dirt off, and covers the flare of her chakra as she inscribes the seals by summoning her chains. Slowly, the masked man pushes to his feet. There's blood darkening his cloak, a wet patch that's growing steadily, and he presses a hand over it as he eyes her chains.
You tried to use those once,
he says mockingly.
And look where they got you. Are you so eager to try again?
Kushina bares her teeth at him.
Try me, asshole! I'll show you just what an Uzumaki can do!
An old laugh, derisive and taunting.
I've fought an Uzumaki before. I fought your brother and sent him running with his tail between his legs.
Her brother. Kushina's breath catches in her throat and she twitches, wanting to look behind her to glance at the other figure she overlooked in favor of her son. Is that him? Is that the rogue Uzumaki they brought her back to face? Somehow, she manages, though the words are hard to force out. I don't think that's quite what happened, you know. The one visible eye narrows.
Believe what you want,
he tells her, sharp and cold. With a flick of his wrist, he unbuckles the cuff holding the Gunbai's chain in place and lets it fall.
I'm through wasting time with you. Move, or I will move you.
Kushina laughs outright at that vicious and all but vibrating with angry tension. She hefts the shuriken in her hand, listening to them clink, and grins at the masked man in the way that used to make even Minato falter. Not even in your dreams, bastard!
You have no idea what I dream.
The masked man growls, and a hail of kunai launch themselves out of the warping air, headed right for her. He smells stale air and stagnant water, whetstone dripping in incessant rhythm into the pool below, and opens his eyes to the sight of a prison he thought himself well rid of. This isn't like the time Kurama went looking for Matatabi's chakra and followed it right to Yugito. Then the door of the cage stood open, the seal torn right down the center, and Kurama had stepped out, the way he had when Naruto had finally befriended him. Now Kurama is on the other side of the bars that are still sealed tight, staring at the huge, hulking form of his past self. Red eyes are narrowed, assessing, but Kurama gives them a single look and heads for the tiny figure just pulling himself upright. Naruto, you okay? He asks, picking the little boy up.
Kuramani!
Naruto throws his arms around his neck, squeezing tightly, and says, I'm lost, Kuramani! I don't want to be here, but I don't know how to get back! He's fine, Kurama repeats that to himself, gently rubbing a hand over Naruto's back and gives his former self a dark glare over the boy's shoulder. You're okay, kid. I found you. I'll always find you. And it's not your fault that this asshole dragged you here.
Kuramani?
Naruto lifts his head, staring at Kurama quizzically, and then cranes his head around. There's a low, rumbling laugh, full of a malice that makes Kurama's head spin, and the Kyuubi rises slowly to his feet. He means me. The Biju growls, stepping forward out of the shadows of his prison and dipping his head. His jaws lie open, showing every last tooth, and he grins when Naruto squeaks and burrows tighter into Kurama's arms. Back off, Kurama warns darkly, putting his own growl into the words. Red eyes shift to stare at him, narrowing cautiously. You, the Kyuubi says. Another Uzumaki come to seal me away for good. Are you the one who inherited the other half of my chakra? The question pulls Kurama up short, surprise and then incredulity flooding him. All of his siblings recognized him. Even Shikaku, half crazy and in the middle of a temper tantrum, managed to recognize him. But his old self just doesn't? It's the most hilarious joke Kurama has ever heard, and he's the punchline. Damn you to hell and back, Naruto, he thinks, and can't make it anything but fun. He laughs, not bothering to hide the amusement or the mockery that make it up in equal parts. I don't have half your chakra, bastard. I have all of it. He retorts and raises a hand, power curls tasting of malice and anger and fire in the wind. The Kurama smirks at his old self. The Kyuubi rears back, indignation and fury growing on his face, and snarls like he wants to rip Kurama's head right off his shoulders. The bars creak faintly as his chakra builds, but they don't budge. That power isn't yours, he growls. You don't have any right to it. Strange now to remember 100 years of imprisonment, impotent and angry. 100 years pinned down, caged, used, all because the humans believed him in danger. Because a human stole his will and turned him into a weapon, turned him against Hashirama, and rather than simply free him, Mito had torn him out of his physical form and trapped him in her soul like a firefly in a child's jar. Easy now to remember the anger that came with his bonds, the fury and helplessness it took Naruto at his brightest to finally lift. 100 years a prisoner, and Kurama is so recently come to the change that he can sometimes hardly believe it himself. Taking a breath, he lets it out slowly, allows Naruto to slide down until the boy is braced on his hip instead of clinging to his neck like a monkey. "I think you need a change," he says as evenly as he's able. All it takes is a touch of will, a familiar memory, and the air around them bleeds away the darkness. Trees spring up around them, great trunks that dwarf even the QB, and green branches spread out high above them. The seal remains, plastered to one of the closest trunks, but the bars fade, the rock melts, and in a moment they're standing in the sage's clearing. The sound of the QB's indrawn breath is loud in the silence. "How?" he demands, rising to his full height, but there's bewilderment creeping in beneath the fury. "My name is Kurama," he says quietly. "It was given to me by the Sage of Six Paths a very long time ago. I think you remember the moment." "Impossible," the QB snarls, lunging, but the seal crackles and yellow light forces him back. The roar that tears from his throat practically shakes the trees, making Naruto flinch, but Kurama squeezes him gently and doesn't give ground. "Very possible," he says coolly, meeting Furia's crimson eyes. "Time travel's really so hard to believe." There's a long pause and then a disgusted snort. "And you end up looking like that," the QB sneers. "Pathetic. That little worm, is it yours?" Kurama bristles, and here in their mental world, the swirl of his chakra is fiery red, traced with black, and curls around him like a shroud as it rises. The QB stiffens at the feel of it, and that tears an ugly laugh from Kurama's throat. "Pathetic!" he repeats, and this time when he bares his teeth, it's definitely not a grin. "No! I have all of the chakra I need. I remember the sage's words to me. I know my power, and I know my goals. But you're the pathetic one here scrambling for a foothold, trying to corrupt a child because you can't pass the time any other way. I want to be free." The QB snarls, lunging at him again. Golden light forces him back, but he digs his claws into the earth and holds, looking down to level a fiery, furious stare right at Kurama. "No, you understand. 6 years since she pinned me with those seals, drove them right through my body and called them love. You've been corrupted, but..." Kurama takes a breath and slams his chakra down like a hammer blow. The QB reels under the force of it, staggering back, and Kurama carefully sets Naruto down on the ground, steps past him until he's right up against the edge of the seal. "Mito and Kushina chained me," he agrees low and dark. "I spent 100 years wanting nothing more than to break free and destroy every last human. But it got me nowhere. Every time I tried to get loose, they added more chains, and every time it got harder. I remember exactly how you're feeling right now. But the only way to break free is to accept help. Kushina didn't want to be our jailer. Naruto didn't either. It was decided for them. Kushina chose the same path as Mito, but Naruto is different. He's special, like the sage." The silence is disbelieving, incredulous, but Kurama doesn't let his gaze waver. The QB stares back at them, still bristling, but he hasn't tried the seal again. At this point, that's really all Kurama can ask for. "Kuramani?" Naruto asks again, and a hand fists in the leg of Kurama's pants. Kurama leans down and picks him up, balancing the boy on his hip. He turns to his past self almost defiantly, putting a glower behind it, but the QB is staring at Naruto rather than at him. Naruto looks up at Kurama, then back at the QB. His fingers find Kurama's shirt, but he keeps his gaze locked on the fox and asks with only a faint thread of weariness. "Kuramani said somebody bad made you attack Konoha. Is that true?" For a moment, Kurama thinks he'll have to prod the QB into answering, but instead he lowers his head, and even though his teeth are still slightly bared, he's making no move to lunge at them again. "It is.
And Uchiha stole my free will and turned me into a damn puppet for the second time. And like before, he's not the one who took the blame. I was. Because I'm the monster, and I will never be anything else, little worm. Your pet version over there might have gone soft, but I never will.
Kurama rolls his eyes. He doesn't even have to spare a glance at Naruto's face to know what he's about to... Then I'm gonna be your friend! Naruto declares firmly, and his grin is wide and bright! And I'll protect you, so that doesn't happen again, and when we're friends, you can meet all my other friends, and they'll protect you too!
What?
The Kyuubi sounds absolutely bewildered, and Kurama gives into the urge to laugh long and loud. He buries his face in Naruto's spiky hair, shoulders shaking with the force of it, and holds the little boy tight. If his cheeks are just the littlest bit damp, if his eyes are slightly wet, well, just this once, Kurama thinks he can be forgiven.